Thank you, Trey. Am I on? Can you hear me? All right. It was 1987, and Keith Smart's the one who took that shot. And I remember being so impressed with Trey Mouton and his family when I was there visiting in Louisiana. And at that time, I had a 1-year-old son. And I remember thinking, especially since basketball was the subject and it was around March Madness time, I remember thinking if I ever have another son, it would be really cool to name him Trey. I'd never met anybody named Trey until I met Trey Mouton. And I thought, if I ever have another son, I can name him Trey, he'll play basketball, and I can just hear the announcer, Trey Faull comes down the court and he puts up another tray and it's down. And so I had this dream in my mind, and sure enough, God blessed us with another son, named him Trey. He's not a basketball player anymore. He played basketball in high school. He's a preacher in Massachusetts now, and he's named after Trey Mouton. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. We got a good MC this week, and appreciate Trey doing that, and appreciate the music tonight. How about a shout out for the people who are leading us in worship this week? Great job. Always great. But the announcements, no swimming. I was here at a men's retreat in January and they cut the ice and they went swimming. So I don't understand a rule that happens nearly in May that was not in place in January. No, I understand. John and Holly Pfeiffer, how about a round of applause for them? They've done such a great job planning this and getting ready. It was a couple of months ago. They sent me a text and it said, could you send us your address because we want to know where you're coming from so we can figure out how to pay you for mileage. And I just immediately texted back and I said, I'll be coming from Los Angeles, California. And today they sent out a text to everybody, said, we're looking forward to seeing you tonight. And I thought I'd be smart. And so I texted back and I said, is that tonight? I thought that was next week, and they texted right back and they said, you California people don't know anything. So I'm not going to try to mess with them anymore. Now, one other thing, I hate to be that guy, but tonight I have to be that guy. I knew it when they invited me to come and share tonight. I have an early morning obligation in Indianapolis tomorrow, and so worse than somebody who eats and runs is somebody who eats and preaches and runs. But I apologize ahead of time. I knew I was going to have to do that. And then came tonight, was driving on 69, saw a big billboard. It says that this is the donut capital of the world. I've been here many times, did not know that. Had I known that, I would have been here much sooner for the donut capital of the world. Could you pray with me as we begin? Father, as we open your word, would you help us open our eyes, our hearts, our ears, and our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going fishing. That's what he always said when he didn't know what else to do. For as long as Peter could remember, that had been his default mode. You know, he was one of the original disciples of Jesus. He had walked and talked and eaten with Jesus more times than he had count. He had been the first to confess Jesus, to defend Jesus in the garden, to deny Jesus in the courtyard. He saw Jesus after his resurrection, but now he was in the in-between time. He was in the in-between time between the resurrection and the ascension and the Great Commission, so he did what he always did. He did what he knew best. He went fishing. And he took 7 other of the disciples with him. And if you're familiar with John 21, you know that this ends up being their third encounter with Jesus after his resurrection from the dead. We're going to leave that for a moment and come back to it later. First, let's acknowledge something about Jesus and faith. Jesus was not a clickbait kind of rabbi. Nobody could accuse Jesus of bait and switch tactics. He did not attract his followers with some gimmick or sales talk only to reveal the call for sacrifice later. He wanted any would-be follower to know the score and count the cost. He wasn't like one of those tricky recruiters who emphasized the benefits and never mentioned the possibility of danger and combat. So as we begin, let me just say this clearly. There was no hidden cost behavior with Jesus. Jesus always called for full surrender, and he always did so with full disclosure. He was not one who would hide behind the conditions of fine print. In fact, I heard someone say the other day, Jesus led with the fine print. National Public Radio recently reported that a high school teacher from Georgia won $10,000 because she read the fine print. Her name was Donalyn Andrews, and she closely read the terms and conditions that came with a travel insurance policy that she purchased for the trip. And the company inserted in the fine print some language that promised a reward to the first consumer that contacted them when they read it. $10,000. The company said, we understand most customers don't actually read contracts or documentation, but we know the importance of doing so. So we created the top secret Pays to Read campaign in an effort to highlight the importance of reading policy documentation from start to finish. And she won $10,000. In 2017, 22,000 people who signed up for free Wi-Fi inadvertently agreed to 1,000 hours of community service cleaning toilets and relieving sewer blockages. The company said that it inserted the verbiage into the agreement to illustrate the lack of consumer awareness of what they're signing up for when they access free Wi-Fi. Others unknowingly agreed to give away their child in exchange for Wi-Fi. Before they could get on the internet, users had to check a box agreeing to assign your firstborn child to us for the duration of eternity. But it gets worse. On April Fool's Day 2010, GameStation inserted a new clause into its license agreement with a checkbox already ticked. If you didn't uncheck the box, you agreed to grant GameStation a non-transferable option to claim now and forevermore your immortal soul. Jesus, the one who holds your soul, did not hide his calls for allegiance. He openly called for full surrender, and he gave full disclosure, and he presented both the sacrifices and the rewards of following. Let me just say it this way. Long before we, his followers, started talking about the nature of faith, long before we struggled with the fullness of salvation by grace through faith, long before we attempted to reconcile faith and works with Paul and James, long before we noted that even the demons believe and tremble, long before we underdefined faith as a mere mental assent, long before we did Greek word studies on the word pistis for faith, Jesus made it clear that real faith is faithful faith. Faithful loyalty and allegiance to Jesus. In the trenches, rubber meets the road, real life, full on faith. I mean, just think about it for a minute. Consider the follow me moments and statements in Scripture. Follow me, and I will make something out of you. Follow me, let the dead bury their own dead. Follow me, sell all that you have. Follow me and give up your stuff and you'll be repaid. Follow me and deny yourself, take up your cross. Follow me and don't worry about the other disciple, you just follow me. Full surrender, full disclosure. A guy by the name of Brad East in Christianity Today said, Jesus is not looking for adherence of a religion, a mental assent, plus a weekly morning obligation in exchange for post-mortem amnesty. Jesus is looking for people who will follow him as king. Now, some of us are a little older than others in this room, and some of us remember maybe 30 years ago when the then governor of New York was a guy named Mario Cuomo. And he was considering a run for the presidency, and he vacillated back and forth, and he couldn't decide whether he wanted to throw his hat in the ring or not. And so one night in an evening interview, sitting in his plush Manhattan office, sipping coffee while the skyline behind him grew dark, he actually brought up to the reporter the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, Mario Cuomo. And this is what Mario Cuomo said, and I quote, he said, "I dearly wish I'd just get a sign from heaven. I often wonder why God was so good to Paul. Here's a guy named Saul riding along on a horse. God hits him in the tush with lightning and says, Saul, you better become a Christian. Get straight in a hurry. When it's all over, you'll be right here with me eating vanilla ice cream forever. And Cuomo said, do you know what an incredible stroke of luck that would be? Can you just imagine if you could just get hit with a little lightning? That's it. That's what you're supposed to do. It would make life so simple, he said. Really? Now, I know what he was saying. We all wish that God would just tell us exactly what his specific will is, but to characterize Paul's decision and ride as a Christian as easy? In my opinion, there's just one word for that: clueless. If the governor had known Paul's real story of conversion, he'd have heard what God said about Saul's future. I will show him what great things he must suffer for my sake. That is hardly eating vanilla ice cream forever, is it? Now that's important when we talk about following Jesus, because Jesus said some hard and some difficult things. In fact, in John's gospel, Jesus said some things that were so difficult that some people deserted him. John 6:60 says, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, well, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And appropriately in John 6:66, it says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And he looked at his disciples in verse 67 and said, you don't want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. And Simon Peter answered, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Gordon MacDonald put it this way: when the crowd got too large, Jesus would inevitably sharpen the blade of his teaching, and he would make it clear that there was a dramatic cost to discipleship. It was almost as if he was saying, the size of this crowd suggests that you haven't heard me plainly enough, or some of you wouldn't be here, so let me give it to you another way. And when he finished restating his message, people would leave, because then they really understood. Scholar F.F. Bruce wrote a book called The Hard Sayings of Jesus. And there are many others who have written similar works. I've had that book on my shelf for years. I got it out the other day. I couldn't remember what sayings were in there, and so I figured there would be about 12 hard sayings of Jesus. There were 70. And as I looked at the sayings, I realized there's more than that. When you think about the hard sayings of Jesus, the reason they're hard is because they each have at least 3 levels of difficulty. Think about it. The first level that makes a hard saying is, well, what's it mean? There's a level of meaning and understanding. What's it mean to eat my flesh and drink my blood? What's he mean when he says pluck out your eye? What's he mean when he says hate your family? What's it mean when he says a camel going through the eye of a needle? What's it mean when he says I did not come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword? What's it mean when he said let the dead bury their own dead? What's it mean when he said don't cast your pearls before swine? So level number 1 of the hard sayings of Jesus is what's it mean? Level number 2 of the hard sayings of Jesus is do I agree? Because it calls for agreement and acceptance. Do I really believe Jesus when he says it's more blessed to give than receive? Do I believe him when he says the first shall be last and the last shall be first? Do I believe him when he says not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven? Do I believe him when he says it's best to serve, not to be served? Do I believe him when he says give to those who ask of you? So the second level of difficulty is, do I agree? What's it mean? Do I agree? And then the third level of difficulty is the hardest one. What is it? Will I do it? No wonder they're called the hard sayings of Jesus. Will I turn the other cheek? Will I love my enemy? Will I rejoice when I'm persecuted? Will I refuse to lay up treasures on earth? Will I not swear by heaven or earth? Will I serve instead of being served? Will I go sell all that I have? Will I give to those who ask of me? And one of the things that haunts me most as a follower of Jesus is looking at those arenas of my life where I think I have not fully obeyed those hard sayings. What's it mean? Do I agree? And will I do it? And if you want to see all 3 of them demonstrated in one incident, you can just think of the familiar story of Nicodemus in John chapter 3 when Jesus said, you must be born again. Well, what's that mean? How can a man enter again into his mother's womb? And do I agree? And will I do it? And so the hard sayings of Jesus must be understood and interpreted correctly, believed and acknowledged, and accepted as truth, and then fully and finally implemented and lived out in the real world. And perhaps the hardest statement of all, in Mark chapter 8, he called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." He said, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow. I'm afraid that means more than just some of the difficult pains and inconveniences and trials of life. You know how we say, well, that's just my cross to bear. The cross was a symbol of death that criminals and revolutionaries underwent. And it's often been pointed out, would you wear a necklace around your neck with an electric chair on it as the focal point? An electric chair or gallows or lethal injection or a firing squad. It's a jarring thought, but it makes Jesus' point pretty plain. One writer says that perhaps some 30,000 crucifixions occurred under Roman authority during the lifetime of Christ. It was not an unfamiliar sight. And so as Jesus spoke, anyone wants to be my disciple, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. The disciples pictured a death march, not a simple challenge. And Jesus said, if you're not willing to do this, you cannot be my disciple. Do any of you remember the comedian Yakov Smirnoff? He first came to the United States from Russia, and he was not prepared for the incredible variety of instant products that were available in American grocery stores. He says, on my first shopping trip, I saw powdered milk. You just add water to the powder, and instantly you have milk. He said, and then I saw powdered orange juice. Just add water, and you get orange juice. I don't know about you, we called that Tang when I was a kid. And then he said, I saw powdered potatoes. Just add water and get mashed potatoes. He said, and then I saw baby powder. And I thought to myself, wow, what a country. You know, when it comes to disciple making, there is no instant, just add water formula. There are no shortcuts. Biblical faith, saving faith, genuine faith is full on faith. It is allegiance and loyalty to Jesus, because Jesus is not a product that we're receiving or a concept that we are peddling. He is a king that we are following. Now, we understand how this gets misunderstood. In our zeal to protect the reality of salvation by grace and in our desire to make the gospel attractive and palatable, I'm afraid that we have greatly undersold the terms of discipleship and the definition of faith. There's this guy named John Mark Comer who says, in the West, we are more concerned about avoiding a work salvation than we are about avoiding sin. In addition, he says, we have failed to distinguish between the concepts of earning and effort. Discipleship involves effort. Vance Havner famously said, salvation is a helmet, not a nightcap. It often takes effort and courage to follow Jesus. The life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. Let me ask you this. How could we ever read Hebrews 11, the great faith chapter, and not see this definition of faith? How could we ever look at the lives and the responses of the original 12 disciples and not see this? How could we even read the great champions of salvation by grace and not acknowledge this? How could we look at Jesus, the author and object of our faith, and miss this? I recently heard Matt Proctor preach, and he said, if you're going to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. I saw the sign above my head, get comfortable being uncomfortable. So back to Peter's fishing trip. Can you imagine the disciples' sense of deja vu when Jesus appeared to them on the shore while they were fishing for the third time after he raised from the dead? In that famous, isn't that just like Jesus scene? I'm going fishing. Man, deja vu. Fished all night and caught nothing. Deja vu. Familiar voice from the shore. Catching anything? Deja vu. Hey, throw your net over here where I tell you. Deja vu. Net so full you could hardly pull it in. Deja vu. Get out of the boat. Deja vu. Fish and bread with Jesus by the campfire. What a sense of deja vu. He took the bread and he gave it. Deja vu. And the disciples were afraid to ask him anything else. Deja vu. When they had finished eating, deja vu. And Jesus asking hard questions. Deja vu. Talking about sheep and discipleship. Deja vu. And I'm assuming something here tonight. I'm assuming this is a biblically literate group, so you know the story. As Peter is restored, he had denied Jesus 3 times, and now Jesus is having him reaffirm his love 3 times. We're not going to go into that right now. But he points Peter back to being a disciple and making disciples. And then he says something very interesting that Peter and the rest of the apostles who were there, the rest of the disciples who were there, knew exactly what he meant. This is what he said, John 21, verse 18. He said to Peter, specifically to Peter, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you, lead you where you don't want to go." And the next verse explains, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, and then he said to him, "Follow me." You're going to die, and you're not going to like the way it happens. Follow me. There it is again. Full surrender, full disclosure. Now watch Peter deflect and point to John and ask what Jesus wants out of John. Verse 20. Peter turned and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" And when Peter saw him, he said, "Lord, well, what about him? What about John?" And Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you?" Isn't that a really nice way of saying none of your business? If I want him to return and remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You follow me. Because of this, the next verse says, the rumor spread among the believers that the disciple would not die. But Jesus didn't say he wouldn't die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You know what that tells me? That tells me that Jesus' language was not hidden. When he spoke those words to Peter, Peter and the rest of the disciples knew exactly what they meant. Peter, you're going to die and you're not going to like it. Calling for full surrender and yet giving full disclosure. Calling Peter to full-on faith and full-on life. Do you know how we do this? At least this is how I've done it many times. Well, you know, if the day ever comes that you put a gun to my head, I'll be faithful. Jesus said, no, now. Push comes to shove now. And this has profound implications for you and I in how we follow Jesus for the rest of our lives and how we make disciples. For me as a preacher, it means I give up my own vision of a successful church for his plan for a real church, even if it's smaller. It means I give up my individual and family security for his promise of true security. It means I give up my own version of proper spirituality and doctrine for his unfettered declaration of truth. It means I give up my own definition of a meaningful existence for his description of abundant life. It means I give up my own sense of purpose and accomplishment for his ultimate purpose. I have a friend named Bobby Harrington. I've heard him say it many, many times. The Jesus we preach and the gospel we uphold and the faith we coach determines the disciples that we make. It's plastered all over the walls in the church where I preach. We exist to help people become lifelong disciples of Jesus. It's plastered on the walls. It doesn't mean it always gets done. And I have asked myself over the last couple of years, after 36 years at the same church, how do you get people to become lifelong disciples of Jesus? And that got me thinking, how did I become a lifelong disciple of Jesus? I'm not the greatest disciple in the world. I got lots of failures. I've got lots of flaws. There's still sin in my life. But somehow, I have become a lifelong disciple of Jesus in spite of my flaws and failures. How did that happen? And I think back to my gratitude to my parents. I talked to a woman this evening who knew my grandfather, who is a preacher. She knew my dad, who's a preacher. She knows me. There's my brother. My son is a preacher. My son-in-law is a preacher. How did we become lifelong disciples of Jesus? And as I concentrated on those three things again, I thought, that's how I became a lifelong disciple of Jesus. The Jesus you preach, the gospel you uphold, and the faith you coach determines the kind of disciple that you get. Let me say it again. The Jesus we preach, the gospel that we uphold, and the faith that we coach determines the kind of disciples that we get. And though my parents weren't perfect, they upheld the gospel. And they preached Jesus. And they coached faith. And every church I had an opportunity to be in as I was growing up, though those churches weren't perfect, they proclaimed Jesus, they upheld the gospel, and they coached faith. A faith that calls for full surrender and full disclosure. And what you and I are going to have to do in 2024 is buck the cultural trends of progressivism and legalism and tradition, get rid of the political idols, the leadership and growth idols, and simply be disciples who are making disciples to be those kinds of people and to be a part of those kinds of churches and follow wherever Jesus leads. I think about the verse we talked about earlier. Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And then I think, but he also said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me. I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And it's not that one saying is easy and one saying is hard. They're both hard, and they're both easy. You don't have to say, well, which is it, Jesus? Is it easy or is it hard? Remember, the context of the choice was between the heavy yoke of rules and regulations of 600 plus extra laws of the Pharisees and the fine print and the legalism lists, or the simple commitment of Jesus, follow me, love the people around you. It's hard, but it's easy. There's one big prerequisite to this, and I want you to go back to Mark 8:34 again. He called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple. Whoever wants to be my disciple. Whoever, one translation says, whoever wishes to be my disciple. It's just one simple words, but it'll hit you like a ton of bricks if you'll consider the weight of it. Because so often we talk about our need for Jesus, but how often do we talk about our desire for Jesus? I want Jesus. I mean, Jesus frames 3 death predictions, 3 calls to follow him into death around a desire to do so. It's almost like he's saying, don't do this because you have to. Don't do this because you think it's the way to win. No, do this because you want to. Do this because you want to follow me because I'm what you want above everything else. I think one of the best anti-legalism verses in the Bible is in the Psalms, when it says, don't be like the horse or the mule who has to have a bit or a bridle or they will not follow you. Jesus doesn't want you to be like a horse or a mule where he has to just yank on that bit and jerk you into submission. He wants you to want to follow him. Now, a lot of us read stuff like this or we hear stuff like this and say, man, I don't know if that's what I signed up for. You ever spoken those words? That's not what I signed up for. In what context did you speak them? On the job? In a relationship? In regard to a financial commitment? Fulfilling a volunteer position that was more than it was advertised? More that you bargained for? Or when you didn't read the fine print? Or you were deceived and you bit off a little more than you could chew? Maybe it's in marriage, adjustments, arguments, opinions, pet peeves, snoring, idiosyncrasies, expenditures. Glances over cocktails seem to be so sweet, somehow not so amorous over shredded wheat. This is not what I signed up for. Or maybe you felt that way with parenting: diapers, projectile vomit, sleepless nights, endless crying, constant need, loss of freedom, heartbreak, expenditures. Or maybe you signed up for free college and you went into the military, but then there were these things called deployments, and deserts, and discomforts, and danger, and expenditures. It's not what I signed up for. Here's one of my favorites: pet ownership. Shedding, messes, vet bills, dog food, grooming, dog do, boarding, expenditures. This is not what I signed up for. I signed up for the sweet dog in the picture in front of the fireplace that doesn't stink, that's only there when you want the dog to be there with no responsibility. This is not what I signed up for. We had a boxer. It was the best dog we ever had. It was actually my youngest son's dog, and he went off to college, so he left it at home. So we had the dog for the 4 years while he was in college, and as he was graduating from college, he called me up one day and he said, "Dad, when are you going to bring me my dog?" I said, "Right now." He said, "No, I'm serious." I said, "I'm serious, right now. I'll meet you halfway." He was in Cincinnati, I was in Indianapolis. I said, "I'll meet you at the Skyline Chili halfway. I'll get rid of the dog and I'll eat some Skyline Chili all at the same time." So I drove an hour, he drove an hour, we stopped, and I gave him the dog, and I gave him all the stuff that goes with the dog, and we ate some Skyline Chili. I got back in the car, and I headed home, and I dialed my wife on the cell phone, and she answered the phone, and I said, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." It was a little more than I signed up for. You know, stuff you didn't realize, but yet many would say it's worth it. I've met people who say marriage or parenting or military or pet ownership wasn't worth it, and if they had a redo, they wouldn't do it over again. But I have never met someone who totally sold out to follow Jesus and truly followed him who believes he's not worth it. I'm not talking about religion or church or relationships. I'm talking about sold out following Jesus. And when you come to that, "this isn't what I signed up for" moment, you have a decision to make, don't you? Because following Jesus is what you signed up for, not some sort of check off the boxes transactional style deal. God, if you do this, then I'll do this. If I confess this formula, if I believe this truth, if I take those steps and follow this plan, I'm just a lifelong disciple of Jesus. No. It is full on take up your cross and follow me faith that Jesus calls for. Dr. Wynne Arnn told of a personal experience he once had where some people he was working with invited him to try a trapeze bar that they had been using as a prop. And amazingly, he took them up on their offer, and he climbed up and he grabbed the bar and he swung out into the air. And here's how he related his thoughts about the whole trapeze experience. He said, "Flying through the air, I made 3 important discoveries. First, you cannot hold on to one bar while you're grasping the other. You have to let go with both hands and leap. Second, it's frightening and threatening to let go of your security. And third, you do not have forever to make up your mind." So whether you need to sign up or re-up, it's decision time. It's surrender time. Will you be a full-on follower of Jesus? I don't care how long you've been a Christian or how many years ago you were baptized. Will you decide right now to be a full-on follower of Jesus? You say, how? Well, I think the last verse of John 21 gives us a little bit of a clue. It's really like might be my favorite verse in the Bible, at least one of my favorite verses, John 21:25. It says, Jesus did many other things as well. And if every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. We're talking about the totality of Jesus. That when you think of Jesus, it's not just the 3.5 years that we know of. And even if you knew all the secrets from age 12 on, the silent years, you wouldn't even begin to understand Jesus. And even if you knew everything that happened from creation to the incarnation, you still wouldn't understand everything about Jesus, because there's all that time in eternity before creation. And even if you understood that, and you understood the 33 years, and you understood the 3.5 years, and you understood the silent years, then there's all the years that are yet to come and the years of eternity. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And when you start to concentrate on the magnitude and the totality of King Jesus, you are going to be occupied with Him for eternity and still never scratch the surface. When we are consumed with the inexhaustible, unfathomable totality and magnitude of Jesus, we'll never tire of following Him. I love the statement, may you be covered with the dust of your rabbi. Would you follow Jesus so close that the dust from His sandals is on you? Because that's what He calls for. Full surrender, but He doesn't hide it in the fine print. Full disclosure. Jesus, let Him be the default setting on your mind, the place where your thoughts turn, the one thing you get right, the autopilot of your brain, your operating system, your core, your foundation, your stabilizing force, your guiding principle, your ultimate value, your sweetest past memory, your greatest future hope, your bedrock foundation, your first thought when you wake up, the last one when you drift off, the architect of your dreams, the chief controller of your heart, the conductor of your life symphony, the GPS, the compass, the map, your confidence, your strength, your comforter, your challenger, the one who captures your affections and your intellect and your will and your conscience all at the same time, the object and the focus of your faith, the CEO of your existence, your first responder, your first response, your last reality, your first resort, the one clear word on your lips if you're ever incoherent and drooling on yourself someday. Your defender and your judge and your provider and your servant and your king and your prophet and your priest and your teacher and your friend. He is your worldview, your philosophy, your central reality, your religion, your belief system, your hub, your deity. You were made by Him and for Him and through Him, purchased by Him, dwelling in Him and He in you. In Him dwells the fullness of the Godhead in bodily form. He raised you up with Him. He's the reason for your existence in every way, at every level. He is your hope of glory, your Lord and your God. And if we get that right, we'll be all right. Let's pray.